So I've talked about Japan's westernization, and I've talked about its mastery of grand strategy, and now here's my third reason of how they overturn the balance of power, and it has to do with pegging the culminating point of victory in the Russo-Japanese War. And now for a commercial break, I'm going to give you some terminology, which are culminating point of attack, culminating point of victory. They're different. Culminating point of attack is an operational term. If you do not reach your culminating point of attack, it means you could have gone further. And the culminating point of attack applies to a single battle or a set of battles, which would be called a campaign. So if you don't go far enough in your battle, you could have taken more territory, whatever it was you were after. If you go too far, so imagine you're going deep into whatever territory it is, your lines are ever more extended, your enemy's lines are probably being shortened, your supply problems are getting worse, theirs might be getting better. If you go way too far, your enemy will launch a counterattack that will send you much further backwards than if you'd been a little more cautious about how far you went. So that's an operational term. The strategic term is culminating point of victory, and it concerns the objective for which the war was fought. Japan's fighting this war in order to protect its sovereignty, become a great power to do that. If you don't go far enough and if you don't reach your culminating point, you could have gotten greater winnings. If you go too far, typically what will happen is you will trigger a third-party intervention. And what may have been feasible before that third party joined the party may no longer be. So this is the point of the terminology. Oh, commercial break is over, and let's get going on the Russo-Japanese War. Here's a nice map of it. So it starts out with a Japanese surprise attack on Port Arthur, Lushun, modern name, I'm using a traditional name. It's on the Liaodong Peninsula. This is the main Russian base. The Japanese have to get those ships in base and sink them even better because their supply lines are in danger if that Navy's out and about. Simultaneously, they land an army in Korea that's going to go northwest into Manchuria. And if you look at the railway line, it goes Port Arthur all the way to Harbin up there. That's the east-west junction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. In those days, that's the Chinese Eastern Railway. And I've only listed a couple of the major battles, but basically it's going up the railway system from Port Arthur upward. And you got the Liaoyang and Mukden. And Japan has got only 4 armies until the very end of the war when it gets a 5th. And one army, as long as Port Arthur has ships in it, it has to be stuck there besieging it. And Japan's theory of victory in this thing is to have an annihilating battle. That's what Bismarck had done to the French in the Battle of Sedan. And so the Japanese really need to get that army out of Port Arthur so that it can concentrate on these other battles. What happens is Russia keeps losing the battles, but it has an orderly retreat moving ever further northward, extending Japanese lines. So that's an overview of how the war goes so you can orient the rest of the conversation here. If you look at the invasion routes that Japan uses in the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, they're remarkably similar because guess what? The geography hasn't changed. And so if you want to send an army in to desired locations, it may well have to take similar routes. And the British, the French, the Americans, Japanese had studied very carefully the First Sino-Japanese War. But apparently the Russians didn't waste their time on it because here's what's up. If the Russians had studied it carefully, they would have known the Yalu River is lethal to send an army across that if there's an army waiting for it on the other side. The Russians also would have realized that this Feng Shui Pass and the Motian Pass, Motian means literally scratch the skies, that if you're prepared there, you're going to ruin an army coming through. Of course, the Russians aren't prepared there. And then they also would have known the Liaodong Peninsula, it has a very narrow neck. If you cut the narrow neck, which is right where Dalny is, a big commercial port, you're going to get that port, which is connected to the railway, and you're going to be able to supply your armies going right up north. In addition, it means you're probably going to get Port Arthur, the big naval base, as well, because it's basically been turned into an island, and you'll probably get that. So the Russians should have figured out that but they didn't. The Japanese literally blast through these locations. And here is the key to reducing the fleet in Port Arthur. Since the Russians wouldn't sortie, they're just sticking in harbor. So the Japanese have to figure out a way to do it. Here's how it works. They have to get a bunch of these 11-inch howitzers in place. Japan didn't own many of these. They're really heavy. It's really hard to transport them with horses and things. They've got to put them behind the hills in Port Arthur. And then they've got to take the high point, which takes them a while to figure out that they needed to do this, is 203-meter hill. You put a spotter on 203-meter hill. This thing starts firing shots, and the spotter starts radioing in how you have to adjust the line of fire in order to hit the ships in harbor. So that's what's going on here. Here you can see the narrow neck there above Dalny. You can see it's a big port. We put a lot of ships, but not a very protected port. And the star is where Port Arthur is, and that is a protected port where you want to put naval vessels. And you can see it takes the Japanese 2 months to work their way down the Liaodong Peninsula to get themselves in position to blow away the ships in port. Meanwhile, Japanese armies are having a hard time while this is going on. It could be argued that maybe they even reached their culminating point of attack in the Battle of Liaoyang. Who knows? Liaoyang takes place less than halfway through the war. It's in early September 1904. And Japanese munitions, numbers of officers, numbers of horses, it all goes critical. They don't have enough. They get away with it. They win the battle, but they don't. The Russians have an organized retreat northward. And at the Battle of Shahe, which happens next in October, the Japanese supply system almost collapses, but they get away with it. And so bad things are going on at land. Japan doesn't have an infinite supply of soldiers. So you can also look, they don't have an infinite supply of artillery howitzers and things. Here are their gun emplacements. Notice the green ones are army guns emplacements around Port Arthur. That makes sense. What's all the purple? They have so few guns, they're pulling them off ships in order to reduce Port Arthur. And all these things they really need up in Manchuria. They need Nogi, General Nogi, who's running all of this, his army up in Manchuria. And there you can see the circle is where 203-meter hill is, that they need to take that as well. All right, so General Nogi, who is commanding the Third Army, which is in charge of the siege, he is really desperate to reduce the fortress as soon as possible. And he runs 4 different really costly infantry assaults on a fortress where you're killing lots of Japanese young men. And he does them, the first 2 occur right prior to major battles, Liaoyang and Shahe respectively, because he wants to win those battles, win Port Arthur, so then he can take his guns and troops to fight at Liaoyang and Shahe. Well, it's not to be because he loses both of them. The assaults are insufficient. And it's only after the second one that he realizes the importance of 203-meter hill. The problem is Nogi gets 45,000 Japanese soldiers killed doing this. 45,000 soldiers in that day is an entire army. And I've already pointed out that Japan only had 4 armies until the very end of the war when it tries to cobble together a 5th one. Here's what 203-meter hill looks like from down below. Here's what it looks like from up top, the kind of view you get. When there was a truce in early December 1904, and there was some talking between Japanese and Russian officers said, "You will never capture 203-meter hill," to which the Japanese officer replied, "We will purchase it in blood." And they did. And their gamble paid off because all these ships, you'll notice they're listing. It's because they ain't sailing anywhere. The 203-meter hill, they take it the end of November, and within the week, they are now sinking all of these battleships, and they're gone within a few days. And the Russians give up at Port Arthur, and the Third Army is up and heading into Manchuria, where it'll be there for the Battle of Mukden, which is a huge battle. It's got, 500,000 troops? But even so, Russia can muster 125,000 more troops than Japan can. Japan in this battle is just taking anybody, young boys, old people, whoever they can put into that army, they're putting into it. And you could argue that they're well beyond their culminating point of attack, but for incompetent Russian strategy. If the Russians had run one more battle against the Japanese, their Japanese supply lines would have collapsed, and it's unclear how far down the Liaodong Peninsula they would have had to retreat. So this is when Japan's war termination plan goes into effect, the Japanese realized from the very beginning that they had a high risk, high reward strategy. And in contrast to World War II, they had a really carefully prepared exit strategy. So when Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi is convening the cabinet and they're going to make the decision to fire the first shots in this war, he is already lining up a Harvard grad, here, Viscount Kaneko, who was an acquaintance of President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States, then president. And what they want is to have Viscount Kaneko work on getting Roosevelt ready to do mediation at the end of this war. And the peace treaty is going to be held in, negotiations are going to be held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, negotiated by another Harvard alumnus, Baron Komura, who's going to do all of that. Meanwhile, Ito sends his son-in-law, who's a Diet member, but also a graduate of Cambridge University, off to Britain to keep the Anglo-Japanese alliance solid. So the Japanese are very aware that you got to have a way out of this thing. So it's in the Battle of Mukden that Field Marshal Yamagata decides it's time to call the American card at this moment. He said, look, the enemy's never going to request peace unless we have invaded Moscow or St. Petersburg, something he knows to be impossible. And he does an assessment. He said, look, the enemy still has powerful forces in its home country. We have already exhausted ours. Second, while the enemy still does not run out of officers, we have lost a great number since the opening of the war and cannot easily replace them. At this moment, the Russian army was 3 times the size of the Japanese army. And that army in theater was increasingly comprised of crack soldiers, not the kind of colonial kind of soldiers they'd started out with. And so here's the Field Marshal Yamagata, who in the first Sino-Japanese War, because the government in Tokyo was afraid he was going to march on Beijing and do regime change, they pulled him out of theater and gave him a sinecure to make sure he didn't do that. This time, he's a wiser man. He goes, we must now be prudent. And here are other members of this brilliant Meiji generation. The chief of staff of the Manchurian army said, look, if you start a fire, you got to put it out. And here is the Field Marshal Oyama, who is the commander of Manchurian forces. But before he sets out to take command, he tells the Navy minister, I will care for fighting in Manchuria, but I'm counting you as the man to tell me when to quit. So the Navy is going to be the fire department, apparently. To tell you what the Navy was up to, they took Elliott Island to turn it into a cruiser base, and that's how they're running the blockade operations on Port Arthur of keeping the Russian fleet in until they can eventually sink it there. In addition, the Imperial Japanese Navy is busy laying mines. A lot of ships go down to mines. So this is an interesting story. So Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, doesn't much like it that his fleet is just sitting in port not doing anything. And so he sends Admiral Makarov out there to assume command. And I've had the misfortune to read Makarov's major literary contribution, which is all about naval strategy. And he's a real hero in Russia, but then I read his book. It's unbelievable. If you face a big ship, what do you do? A more powerful ship, you attack. If it's a smaller ship, what do? You attack. It's like, okay, one size fits all. I mean, how unanalytical. Here's what happens to him. He comes in theater and within the month, another spoiler alert, he's dead. How did that happen? He followed his strategy. That's how it happened. What he does, he arrives. Everyone's really excited because he's getting the guys out and thinking they're going to be doing things. But on April 12th, the evening before he dies, there are a bunch of Japanese ships laying mines out of the harbor's entrance, and he mistakes them for Russian ships and tells his people, don't fire on them. Oops. And the next morning, when he sorties with the whole fleet to be part of his, it's always take the offensive. Well, they didn't sweep the harbor entrance for mines. His ship hits a mine and he goes down with the ship. All right, that is a tactical error, and he's a dead man because of it. However, there's a much more important strategic error that follows. 2 weeks later, Nicholas II decides to send his Baltic fleet, named for the Baltic, that's where it is, all the way around to come and relieve the siege at Port Arthur in order to avenge all of this thing. Okay, what's the problem with that plan? Well, that's the problem with that plan, right? It's a long way to go. There is no air conditioning for the sailors, right? They come from northern climes. By the time they arrive, they're mutinous. Their ships are covered with barnacles, which means they don't move very fast. Meanwhile, once Port Arthur has fallen, the Japanese immediately refit their navy, so they were good to go. And so the way this blunder plays out, well, if you think about Britain will do these worldwide adventures, but they had a complete basing system across the globe so that their ships had coaling stations. They could refit, put more water on, give people some R&R time, relaxation and things. And also the British were very careful to fight on their own terms whenever possible. You don't want to fight on the enemy's terms. Well, guess what? You're going to be fighting right next to Japan, barnacled ships and mutinous crews. That's not going to go well for you. And the Japanese know, because now that Port Arthur falls while this expedition is taking place, so then the purpose of the expedition is no longer there. They should have taken a U-turn and go home, but no, they're going to keep on going. So there is only one other possible location for them, which is an inferior base up at Vladivostok. So the Japanese know there are 3 ways to get to Vladivostok if you're coming up from the south. You're either going to go the long, long way around through the Perouse Strait, and it's awfully narrow, and it's a long way around. You can go through the Tsugaru Strait, which is a little wider, but it goes by a bunch of big Japanese army bases, and also a very large port of Hakodate. You want to do that, that's kind of risky. So the short way is to go through the Korea Strait, which is broken in the middle by the Tsushima Islands, and the Tsushima Strait is to the east. It's 20 to 25 miles wide at its narrowest point, and that's the short way, which is what the Russians take. And guess what? They have a welcoming party there of all these newly refitted Japanese ships that know exactly what they're up to. And the Battle of Tsushima is one of the most lopsided naval battles in human history. The Japanese just either sink or commandeer basically the entire fleet, proving the Russians had no idea of how to do naval strategy, that the Navy had been a product of a bunch of aristocrats who, the one who ran it was a guy who was known for, what was it, fast women and slow ships. It did not work out well for them. All right, while the negotiations were being held on whether to hold negotiations, President Roosevelt suggested to the Japanese that they try to take Sakhalin Island. You can see the tip end of the Japanese home island, Hokkaido, and then there's Sakhalin. Why? Because it's much more valuable to the Russians than the Japanese, and it would be a good trade back item in the peace negotiations. Because for Japan, it's a nice fishing ground, but for Russia, it's sovereign Russian territory. Horrors, ceding that sovereign Russian territory to anyone, let alone an Asian power, given the prejudices of the day. All right, to sum up what Japan got out of this war, it got its immediate war objective, Russian troop withdrawal from Manchuria. That's what they wanted. And they get this Japanese sphere of influence in Korea. That's what they wanted. But remember at the very beginning, they wanted to trade Japanese predominance in Korea for Russian predominance in Manchuria. Whoa, well, let's look what they really got. They got the southern half of Sakhalin Island, Russian territory. They got southern Manchuria, and it's actually arguably the valuable half, the southern half, because that has Port Arthur and Dalny and all the railways that Russians had invested there. And then it confirms the outcome of the first Sino-Japanese War, that Japan is indeed the dominant power of Asia. So I rest my case. Japan did it. Smart decisions in Japan is what overturned the balance of power